Good afternoon. Welcome to Ron's Ramblings. This will be number 7 and will be the second part of the story of Cain and Abel, primarily focused on Abel, who is the one that's listed in Hebrews chapter 11 as being one of the faithful. When we ended Rambling 6, we ended with the conclusion that Cain's wife, that is mentioned there in chapter 4, was one of his sisters. We don't know whether she was a younger sister or an older sister, doesn't really matter. But the truth of the matter was, as I think we proved, is that she was one of his sisters. And I also mentioned, as kind of a by the way, at the time we were talking about that I believe that Cain and Abel were twins, and so that's what I want to address here in the beginning. And then we'll move on to talk about Abel and his sacrifice. If you're a regular Bible reader, and I'm sure you are, you probably have noticed that in almost every instance, if not all, except for Cain and Abel, where successive births of children to the same parents are mentioned, we see two things taking place. We see the act of conceiving, and then we see the act of giving birth. That's not what we see in the case of Cain and Abel's birth. I've got chapter 4, verses 1 and 2 on the screen, and you'll notice those two acts are mentioned in regard to Cain in verse 1. It says, "And Adam knew his wife," that's the conceiving, "and she conceived, and then she bare Cain. And she said, I've gotten a man from the Lord." And we discussed what that meant in the last part. But now, notice it says in verse 2 in regard to Abel, "And she again bare his brother Abel." There's no mention there of another conceiving. So it simply said that she again brought forth Abel, his brother. I can't pronounce the Hebrew phrase that actually exists there, but the English translation of it is again, like it's listed there in the King James Version at least, of the Scriptures. I take that to mean, and obviously I can be wrong, but I take that to mean that Eve's conception, as it's mentioned in verse 1, produced twins. And in most cases, as I'm sure, when twins are involved in a birth, one comes out before the other. Cain, in this case, happened to be the oldest, and I don't know, a few minutes later, perhaps, Abel came out. The Bible doesn't say how long that was, nor does the Bible say anything about them even being twins, whether they were identical twins or not. We can't say, of course, with any degree of certainty that they were twins. But based on what I read here and what the Hebrew dictionaries say in regard to the words that are used, I conclude that they are or were twins. It doesn't matter whether they were or not, they were still brothers. And Cain was the oldest of the two brothers. It says in the latter part of verse 2 that Abel became a shepherd and that Cain became a farmer. Now I'm assuming that it said that Cain became a tiller of the ground, and I assume that meant he raised his crops from the earth. And Abel became a tender of sheep. And so it caused me to think, because those things happened later. Now, though, after their birth, they're children, they're babies, and they are growing up until they become men. And I was just wondering, in that situation, just what kind of a parent do you think Adam and Eve were? I have no doubt that Adam and Eve were beautiful, dynamic people. After all, they were created by God. And after he had crafted their bodies out of the dust of the earth and breathed into their nostrils the breath of life, and then he had created everything, they were created, of course, on the sixth day. And after everything was complete, it is said in Genesis verse 31 of chapter 1, that God looked back on all that he had created and he pronounced it very good. So I have no doubt that as far as it can be determined, Adam and Eve were very good people, very beautiful people, very dynamic people, and they just had one fault. They had a sinful heart in some regards. But that's over and done. They have been expelled from the garden. They once were perfect, destined to live in eternity there in the garden, able to walk and talk with God most every day. But now they had fallen. They were banished from that paradise. They had to find some other place to live. Now, all of the children born to them took place after they left the garden. So the two of them are leaving the garden, being forced out by God. And God placing the flaming sword and the cherubim at the edge of the garden there to where it protected from being entered into again. I'm guessing that they were feeling very sad. I don't know how far they went before they settled and established a new place. Most of the scholars that I have had an opportunity to read don't believe they went very far. Less than a day's journey, it is generally thought. And I'm not going to quibble with that. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but it seems reasonable to me. And shortly after they got settled into their new place, they began to have children. Eventually, we don't know how long, but eventually, Cain and Abel are born. We're not told about their early lives. We know absolutely nothing about it. I suspect they were like most children. They would have had their good days, and they would have had their bad days. There would be days when they played well together, and there would be days when they didn't. I suspect there was some degree of jealousy that existed. Maybe most of it would be on the part of Cain, but I don't know that. And I can see, just stop and think about this. I can see Adam and Eve telling their children, not just Cain and Abel, but all of their children, the story about where they used to live and their early life and what it was like to live in paradise with God talking and visiting with them, if not every day, most days. Living in a situation that is absolutely perfect. I'm pretty sure that they would have been telling their children about God. He was the creator of everything that is, and they would have told their children, I believe, how he talked to them and walked with them in the cool of the evening. I can almost hear them describing all the good things that they saw and had in the garden. I can hear Eve telling them that their dad, Adam, her husband, named all of the animals. Now, the animals existed worldwide, at least known world at that time. And so there were still animals, probably where they lived. And for their children to know that their dad named every animal would be something. I can almost hear them describing the cherubim and the flaming sword that was placed at the end. And if I'm right, and they only went a short distance, maybe less than a day's journey, it's possible in the late evening that they could look toward the garden and would be able to see the glow of that flaming sword as it glowed there and twirled around in all directions. And the cherubim that were guarding the door. I don't know what cherubim look like. In the book of Ezekiel, they're described as having 4 faces. One the face of a man, one the face of a lion, one the face of an eagle, and one the face of an ox, I believe. And they had 4 wings. I think that's all symbolism. I don't think they literally looked that way, but rather it, when taken as a whole, it gives us a good indication of their characteristics and their traits. And they were all vigilant, or they were vigilant, both of them. And if it's true that they only lived a short distance away from where the garden was, it's not difficult for me at all to believe when Cain and Abel grew to be 12, 13 years old, or maybe more, a couple of teenage boys, they would want to go see that. And I don't have any difficulty seeing them go back and look at that sword. I don't know that they did, but I know I would have. It may have gotten me in trouble, but I would have had to have seen it. And I would have gone and looked at it maybe more than once. I don't know whether they did or not. It's not hard to imagine that Adam, as the boys grew, began to educate them on what it would take for them to live. That business about Cain becoming a tiller of the ground, Adam would have had to have shown him either by just example or by instruction how it would be that he needed to care for the land and till it and make it fertile and do the things necessary for plants to grow. And the same is true of Abel. He would have had to known how to care for the sheep. He would have either, again, by instruction or example, learned how to tend a flock of sheep. And I feel very, very certain that throughout all of that, they told their children about Jehovah. Because even though they had failed in their own responsibilities, they knew one thing for certain. God meant what he said. They were living proof of that. So they taught their children, and those boys knew what they were supposed to do. And they knew when the time came that they were to bring an offering to the Lord. Because verse 3 records that there came a time when they brought an offering to the Lord. It is said that Cain's offering was not acceptable. Abel's was. And as it's recorded on the passage you see on the screen, it was by faith that Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. I believe it's fair to say that Abel's faith was stronger than Cain's. He had a degree of faith that righteous people have. Cain, I don't think, had that. I don't know that. It could be that Cain just made a poor decision But because of the things that transpire, I suspect he didn't have the same amount of faith that Abel had. Genesis 4, verses 4 and 5 makes it clear that Jehovah looked with favor upon Cain and Abel. That is, upon Abel and his sacrifice, and did not have favor with Cain and his offering. I want you to pay particular attention to those two verses, because both of those verses explicitly tell us that both the person and the offering is under consideration when Jehovah either approves and accepts or does not. So the clear conclusion would be, I think, that it's not just the sacrifice. It's not whether or not the sacrifice is done in the order that it should be done, but it's the attitude of the one making the sacrifice that has a part in that. Because if you have the right attitude, you're going to do it the right way. If you do not have the right attitude, then you may become lax and do it your own way. But both of those things are mentioned. So when the question is asked, why did God favor Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's? Was it just the offering itself? A lot of people want to make it that way. They say that Cain offered a blood sacrifice, for example. That Abel offered a blood sacrifice, for example, and Cain offered something from the ground. And they say that it takes blood, a blood offering, to be pleasing to God. Well, I know that that's taught, but that's not what's said here. It is said that it is both the person, Cain, and his offering was not acceptable. Abel and his offering was acceptable. I can only draw from that the conclusion that Abel had the right attitude. He wanted to please God, and as such, he knew what he was supposed to bring, and he brought it. Cain, on the other hand, for whatever reason, I suspect it's because he did not have the love of God that Abel had, brought a sacrifice. He went through the motions. It was at the right time. It just wasn't acceptable. And right after that, after God made it known that his offering was not acceptable, Cain's countenance fell. Why? Well, I think Cain knew the answer before God did. If thou doest well, shall thou not be accepted? And if thou dost not do well, then sin lies at the door. You know what happened. Cain felt contempt for his brother and killed him. And for that, God punished Cain. Now, nowhere in the Bible do we find Cain ever saying a word. I'm sure he did. It's just nothing is recorded that he said. But you'll notice in Hebrews chapter 11 in verse 4, it is said that near the end of that verse, that the Hebrew writer records that being dead, yet he speaks. Abel believed God. He lived his life faithful to God. We don't know how long Abel lived. That's not told us. I don't know how old he was. He could have just been a teenager, or he could have been 40 years old. I just don't know. We're not told. But one thing we do know, however long he lived, he followed God. And that faith speaks for him even yet today. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good day.